At 66 years old, Eleanor Vance stood in the gravel driveway of the house she had helped build, watching a professional shredding truck turn 38 years of her life into grey confetti. But what her husband Julian didn't know, what his high-priced legal team had completely failed to account for, is that you can burn every photograph and delete every file, but the truth has a way of staying in the air. He believed he had successfully erased her from the history of his success, but he was about to discover that some ghosts are made of light and data. If you've ever been discarded by the person who promised to protect you, if you've watched decades of your hard work be claimed by someone who never broke a sweat, or if you've been told you're too old to start again just when the world is trying to bury you, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Eleanor found when she powered up a dusty tablet in the corner of a vine-choked cottage will make you believe that justice never forgets a face. The morning air was sharp and smelled of damp earth and diesel exhaust. Eleanor pulled her wool coat tighter against the wind, feeling the weight of the silence that had settled over the property. Julian stood near the front door, his hands in his pockets, looking at the house as if he were checking a receipt. He didn't look at Eleanor. He looked at the stonework, the custom windows, and the manicured lawn. He looked at the assets. Eleanor reached up and touched the silver locket resting against her collarbone. The metal was cold. Usually, the weight of it was a comfort, a small anchor in a world that had become increasingly turbulent. But this morning, the locket felt hollow. It was a physical ache. Julian had taken the photographs out of the frames 3 days ago. He had said it was for the best. He had said that moving forward required leaving the past behind. He had used his soft, caring voice, the one he used when he was about to take something away. She remembered when that locket had been a gift. It was their 10th anniversary. They were still living in the apartment above the bakery. Money was a ghost they chased every month. He had handed her the small blue box with a look of genuine pride. She had worn it every day since. Now, the empty oval of silver was just a reminder of the space where her son's smile used to live. The shredder truck roared again, a mechanical growl that echoed off the garage doors. The men in uniform moved with a cold, professional efficiency. They carried boxes labeled financial records and personal correspondence. Eleanor knew what was in those boxes. It wasn't just paper. It was the evidence of a life lived in the service of another person's ambition. She had spent 3 years sleeping in a cramped hospital chair while Julian recovered from the surgery that saved his life and his business. She never asked for a title when she spent her nights in the basement office, reorganizing his filing system from the floor up. When the firm finally went public, she had worn the same navy blue suit she had bought a decade earlier. She wanted him to have the money for the custom tailoring the investors expected to see. She had been the engine under the hood for 38 years. He was the polished paint job the world admired. Julian checked his watch. It was a gold piece she had chosen for his 50th birthday. He looked at the lead mover and gave a short, sharp nod. The men began to load the final crates. These were the ones Julian had packed himself. Eleanor had tried to look inside them once, but he had steered her away with a firm hand on her shoulder. He had told her she was already stressed enough. He had told her to go sit in the garden and breathe. She watched now as a gust of wind caught a stray piece of paper that had escaped the bins. It danced across the gravel toward her feet. She stepped on it before the wind could take it. It was a scrap of a ledger, a corner of a page she recognized. It was her own handwriting. It was a note about a dividend payment from 20 years ago. She reached down to pick it up, but Julian was suddenly there. He didn't grab her arm. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed his shoe over the scrap of paper. He gave her a small, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. He said it was just trash. He said they were cleaning the slate for her. He told her she would be much more comfortable in the valley. He said the cottage was a clean break. He told her it was what she had always wanted. He called it peace and quiet. Eleanor looked at him and saw the man she had loved. But she also saw the man who had systematically removed her name from every deed and every account while she was busy making sure his coffee was hot and his heart was healthy. He had been planning this exit for years. Every act of care had been a legal maneuver. Every suggestion of rest had been a way to keep her away from the books. The last of the boxes vanished into the dark maw of the truck. The heavy doors swung shut with a sound like a gavel hitting a bench. Julian turned back toward the house that was no longer theirs, but would soon be only his. He didn't offer her a ride. He didn't offer a hand with her suitcase. He told her the lawyer had the keys to the rental car. He said he hoped she found what she was looking for in the woods. Eleanor picked up her single bag. She felt the silver locket bounce against her chest. It was empty, but it was still hers. She walked toward the car at the end of the driveway. She didn't look back at the house. She didn't look back at the man who had turned his life into a fortress of paper and fire. She kept walking. Eleanor Vance, 66 years old, had spent 38 years believing that a marriage was a shared ledger where every sacrifice eventually balanced out. She had been 2 months away from her senior archivist certification when Julian's first venture almost collapsed under the weight of a bad loan. She went to the bank the next morning and signed over the deed to the lakeside cabin her grandfather had left her in his will. She watched the teller stamp the papers and felt a strange sense of peace because she was saving their future. She spent the next 5 years sitting at a metal desk in the back of a drafty warehouse. She tracked every shipment of industrial parts while Julian built his reputation in the city. When he contracted the pneumonia that nearly took his lungs, in 2004, she moved into the hospital room for 12 weeks. She washed his face with a cool cloth and corrected the typos in his contracts while he slept. She wore the same winter coat for 7 years, so the business could afford its first dedicated server. She never asked for her name to be added to the articles of incorporation. She never checked to see if her signature was on the new deeds. She remembered a Tuesday in November during their second year. They had nothing but a shared bowl of soup and a single space heater that rattled in the corner. Julian had taken her hand and told her that her loyalty was the only thing that kept him breathing. He had promised that one day she would never have to worry about a bill again. He had looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. She had believed him then. She believed the way he looked at her in the dim light of that small apartment. She thought she was building a fortress. Every morning for 30 years, her routine had been the same. She made 2 cups of coffee and set them on the granite kitchen island. She checked the weather and laid out Julian's vitamin organizer. She spent her afternoons at the county library, cataloging the town's oldest maps and fragile census records. But her real work happened in the quiet hours of the evening. She was the one who remembered the birthdays of his biggest clients. She was the one who organized the receipts into neat, color-coded folders. She was the archive of his life. She reached up and touched the empty silver locket again. It was a habit now, a nervous tick of her fingers finding the cold metal. She had found it on the vanity 3 days ago. The small, circular photograph of their son, Leo, was gone. Julian had said he was protecting her. He said seeing Leo's face only made the grief of the divorce sharper. He said he had put all the old photos in a safe place. He didn't mention that the safe place was the back of a shredder truck. Eleanor opened her leather purse and looked inside. She saw her library card, a pack of tissues, and her wallet. She opened the billfold and counted the money. She had $124.80. This was the cash she had kept in the kitchen jar for the milkman and the gardener. Julian had frozen the joint accounts the moment the papers were served. He had told her it was a standard legal precaution. He said his lawyer advised him to maintain the status quo. She looked at the digital clock on the dashboard of the rental car. The red numbers blinked. Julian had given her the keys to this car because the lease was up in 2 weeks. He told her it was a practical solution for her move to the valley. He said she would enjoy the change of pace. He mentioned the fresh air and the lack of city noise. He didn't mention the roof of the cottage was half caved in. He didn't mention the black mold in the basement. In the back of the car sat a single cardboard box. It was the only thing Julian hadn't searched. It contained Leo's old electronics. There was a broken laptop, some tangled charging cables, and a thick, ruggedized tablet Leo had used during his summer geology internship. Julian had called it a box of junk. He told her to throw it away before she left. She had tucked it under her coats instead. She put the car in gear and felt the tires crunch on the gravel. The house looked different in the rearview mirror. It looked like a museum where she no longer worked. The tall windows reflected the grey sky. She thought about the 38 years of coffee and vitamins. She thought about the warehouse and the hospital room. She turned the car toward the highway that led to the valley. The map on the passenger seat showed a thin, winding line. It led to a place Julian had described as a liability. He had said the cottage was a gift from his uncle that he never wanted. He said he was doing her a favor by giving her the deed. He said it was a clean break for everyone. The rain began to smear the windshield. She turned on the wipers and listened to them rhythmically clear the glass. Each swipe sounded like a page turning. She was 66 years old and she was driving toward a ruin. She didn't cry. The conference room on the 42nd floor smelled of expensive floor wax and stale coffee. Eleanor sat in a chair that cost more than her first car. She wore her navy blue suit, the one she had pressed herself that morning. The sunlight coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows was too bright. It made the glass table look like a sheet of ice. Julian sat across from her. He was leaning back, tapping a silver pen against his chin. He didn't look like a man ending a 38-year marriage. He looked like a man waiting for a flight. His lawyer, a man named Marcus with teeth that were too white, opened a thick leather folder. "Let's keep this simple," Marcus said. He slid a single sheet of paper across the ice-cold glass. Eleanor looked at the paper. It was a summary of assets. She saw the numbers listed in neat columns. She saw the house they had built together. She saw the investment accounts she had managed for 2 decades. She saw the corporate shares from the firm she had helped name. "We've reviewed the prenuptial agreement from 1988. "I never signed a prenuptial agreement," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet. Julian finally looked at her. He didn't look angry. He looked pitying. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He started scrolling through emails. "You signed the corporate restructuring papers in 2012, Eleanor," Julian said. He didn't look up from the screen. "The ones that consolidated the family holdings into the trust. It was for tax purposes. We talked about this. You told me it was to protect Leo's future," Eleanor said. Julian stopped scrolling. He looked at his watch. He made a small clicking sound with his tongue. "We're being practical, Eleanor," he said. "At your age, you can't manage a property of this size alone. The upkeep would be a burden you aren't prepared for." Marcus cleared his throat. He pointed to the bottom of the page. "Julian is prepared to be more than fair," Marcus said. "He is waiving the claim on the Valley property. It's a clean title. No mortgage, no liens. It's a fresh start." "The Valley property is a ruin," Eleanor said. "The roof hasn't been touched since the 70s. There is no running water in the kitchen." Julian smiled then. It was a quick, sharp expression. He looked at Marcus and then back at Eleanor. "You always said you wanted peace and quiet," Julian said. "Now you have it. It's a clean break. This is what's best for everyone." He leaned forward, his elbows on the glass table. "You have to understand, Eleanor. 38 years is a long time to carry someone who doesn't contribute to the bottom line. I'm simply balancing the books." Eleanor felt the air leave the room. She looked at his hands. They were clean and soft. They had never known the sting of industrial cleaner or the ache of a 12-hour shift in a warehouse. The house to Julian, the investment accounts to Julian, the retirement funds to Julian, the family name to Julian. While he checked a notification on his phone and checked the time for his next meeting, Eleanor received what the lawyers called the residue. She received a rusted iron key. She received a deed for a house buried in vines. She received $42.12 in a new, separate account. "Is there anything else?" Marcus asked. Julian was already standing. He adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of the window. He looked out at the city he had conquered. He didn't look at the woman who had paved the road for him. "I think we're done here," Julian said. "The movers will be there on Friday. Anything left in the house after 5 will be disposed of. We're moving forward, Eleanor. You should try it." He walked toward the door. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer a goodbye. He spoke to Marcus about a dinner reservation at a place that required a 6-month wait. Eleanor picked up the rusted iron key. The metal was cold and smelled of old pennies. She stood up. Her knees clicked, a sharp sound in the silent room. She didn't look at Marcus. She didn't look at the bright, empty city through the glass. "I'll take the key," Eleanor said. She walked out of the office. She walked past the mahogany reception desk. She walked past the young women who didn't look up from their computers. She felt the silver locket against her skin. It felt like a lead weight. She reached the elevator and pressed the button. The doors opened with a soft chime. She stepped inside and watched her reflection in the polished brass. She looked like a stranger. She reached into her purse and felt the tablet in the box. It was cold. It was the only thing Julian hadn't tried to claim. He had laughed when he saw it. He had called it an electronic paperweight. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors slid open. The heat of the city hit her like a physical blow. She walked toward the parking garage. The door clicked shut behind her. Eleanor sat in the driver's seat of the white rental car. The steering wheel felt thin and plastic in her hands. The parking garage was dim and smelled of old oil and concrete dust. She could see the reflection of Julian's glass tower in the side mirror. It looked like a giant silver tooth cutting into the grey sky. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. The screen was bright in the shadows of the car. She opened the banking app. She tapped the screen twice. The balance in her new account was $42.12. She also had the cash from the kitchen jar in her wallet, $124.80, $166.92. That was the total value of 38 years of marriage. It was not enough for a security deposit on a studio apartment. It was not enough for a week at a budget motel. It was not enough to pay a lawyer to look at the papers again. She checked her messages. There were no missed calls. There were no texts from her sister. There were no emails from the few friends who had stopped calling when the divorce became public. The silence of the phone was a physical weight. The screen showed only a notification. The screen showed only a notification about a software update. She reached for the silver locket. It was an automatic movement of her thumb. She clicked the small clasp and felt the hinge. The two oval spaces inside were empty and bright. She ran her fingertip over the smooth metal where Leo's face should have been. Her nail made a small scratching sound in the quiet car. She looked at the passenger seat. The rusted iron key lay on the upholstery. It looked like a piece of scrap metal. She thought about the shelter downtown. She thought about the tiny apartment. Julian wanted her to go away. He wanted her to disappear into a small, manageable life where she couldn't remind him of what he had done. He had given her the cottage. He had given her the cottage because he believed it was a burden that would finally break her. He thought she would take one look at the ruin and crawl back to help. Eleanor gripped the plastic steering wheel. Her knuckles were white. She looked at the GPS screen. She typed in the address from the deed. The red line appeared on the map. It snaked away from the high-rises and the glass offices. It led toward the deep green of the valley. She thought about the box of electronics in the back. She thought about the way Julian had laughed when he saw it. He had called it a collection of ghosts. He had told her that holding on to the past was weakness. Eleanor put the car in reverse. She backed out of the space and turned toward the exit. The tires squealed on the smooth concrete. She drove past the ticket booth. She drove into the afternoon light. The traffic was heavy and loud. She didn't stop at the grocery store. She didn't stop at the pharmacy. She drove until the buildings started to get shorter. She drove until the billboards for Julian's firm disappeared. The locket sat against her chest, light and empty. She followed the red line on the screen. The road began to narrow. The trees on either side were thick with summer leaves. The sun started to dip behind the hills. She was still here. The pavement ended 6 miles past the interstate. Eleanor Vance, 66 years old, steered the rental car onto a gravel path that groaned under the weight of the tires. The trees here were older, their branches arched over the road like rib bones, blotting out the fading afternoon light. The air coming through the vent smelled of wet cedar and the sharp, cold scent of moving water. She reached the town of Oakhaven just as the streetlights hummed to life. It was a single street with a general store under a faded blue awning. A diner with checkered curtains sat next to a gas station with 2 rusted pumps. A man in a high-visibility vest was locking the door. To the post office. He stopped when Eleanor pulled over and rolled down her window. "I'm looking for the old Miller place," Eleanor said. The man walked toward the car. He had a slow, rhythmic gait and eyes the color of flint. He adjusted a leather satchel over his shoulder. He looked at Eleanor for a long beat, his gaze moving from her silver hair to the locket at her throat. "You're Margaret's girl," he said. It wasn't a question. "Elias. I used to carry her mail before she passed. You have her eyes. We've been waiting for you, Eleanor." Eleanor gripped the steering wheel. She hadn't been to this valley since she was 8 years old. She didn't know how anyone could remember her eyes. Elias pointed a calloused finger toward a narrow track that disappeared into the brush. "Follow the creek until the stone bridge," Elias said. "The Vines have had 40 years to work on that house. Don't let it scare you. The bones are good." He didn't ask why she was arriving in a rental car with a single suitcase. He didn't ask where Julian was. He simply nodded and walked toward an old truck parked near the diner. Eleanor followed his directions. The track was barely wide enough for the car. Branches scraped against the doors with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. She found the cottage at the end of the line. Julian had called it a property. The lawyers had called it an asset. To Eleanor, it looked like a green mountain. Wisteria and ivy had climbed the stones and choked the chimney. The porch had sagged into the earth. The windows were dark eyes peering through a thicket of thorns. She stepped out of the car. Her knees ached from the 3-hour drive. The silence was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like a wool blanket over her ears. She walked toward the front door, her boots sinking into the soft, rotting leaves. She reached the door and stopped. She saw a small carving in the wooden frame, nearly hidden by a layer of lichen. It was a tiny ivy leaf, the same pattern her grandmother had embroidered on all her handkerchiefs. It was a mark of belonging. It was the first thing she had seen in months that Julian hadn't touched or appraised. She pulled the rusted iron key from her pocket. Her hand trembled as she fitted it into the lock. The metal groaned. She had to lean her shoulder against the wood and push with all her weight. The door clicked open. The air inside the cottage was a cold, physical weight. It smelled of wet plaster, decades of undisturbed dust, and the sharp scent of rotting wood. Eleanor Vance, 66 years old, stood in the center of the kitchen and watched the dust motes dance. She spent the first 4 hours clearing a path from the front door to the sink. The vines had pushed through the window frames, their thick, woody fingers curling around the cabinetry. She found a pair of rusted garden shears in a shed behind the house. The metal was pitted with orange scales, and the hinge groaned every time she squeezed. Her hands began to throb by noon. The joints in her fingers felt like they were filled with crushed glass. She had to stop every 20 minutes to rub her knuckles, trying to force the blood back into her stiffening grip. She didn't have gloves. The rough bark of the wisteria vines tore at her palms, leaving red welts that stung in the damp air. She moved to the kitchen cabinets next. They were made of heavy oak, built by a man who intended them to last a century. She used a bucket of creek water and a piece of an old undershirt to scrub away the layers of grime. Her lower back sent sharp, rhythmic stabs of pain. Elias appeared on the porch on her third morning. He didn't knock. He simply set a gallon of fresh water and a heavy iron crowbar on the warped wood of the steps. He was wearing the same high-visibility vest and carrying his leather mail satchel. "The pump in the yard is seized," Elias said. He looked past her into the dark hallway of the cottage. "The leather gaskets dried out back in the 90s. You won't get a drop until you pull the housing." Eleanor walked to the door. She felt the silver locket bounce against her chest. "I don't know how to pull a housing, Elias." "I do," he said. He spent 3 hours in the yard. Eleanor watched him from the kitchen window while she tried to scrape mold. Elias worked with a quiet, practiced motion that reminded Eleanor of her own father. When the pump finally groaned and spat out a stream of brown, metallic water, he didn't cheer. He just wiped his hands on a rag and pointed to the crowbar. "Keep that," Elias said. "The floorboards in the pantry are soft. You'll want to check the joists before you put any weight on them." He walked back toward the road without looking back. Eleanor felt a strange lump in her throat. It was the first time in a year a man had given her a tool instead of a lecture. She established a routine. She woke up when the light hit the ivy on the bedroom wall. She boiled a pot of well water on the small camping stove. She spent 6 hours clearing the exterior walls, pulling the vines away from the stone to let the house breathe. She used the crowbar to pry the swollen window frames open. Her dinner was always the same: a tin of beans or a cup of instant noodles. She sat on the porch and watched the sun drop behind the ridge. She thought about Julian's dining room. She thought about the white linen napkins and the wine that cost more than her car. The memory felt like it belonged to a movie. The rain started on the 10th night. It wasn't a soft, summer drizzle. It was a heavy, driving wall of water that turned the yard into a grey marsh. The wind picked up around midnight, howling through the gaps in the stone. The leak in the bedroom started as a slow, rhythmic tap. Then the plaster gave way. A chunk of ceiling the size of a dinner plate hit the floor. Eleanor moved her mattress into the kitchen, dragging it across the dusty floorboards. Her hip joint felt like a hot needle was being driven into the bone. She lay on the damp mattress and watched the water run down the kitchen wall. She reached for her phone. The screen was a bright, mocking void. No missed calls, no messages from her sister, no emails from the bank. The silence of the device was louder than the storm. She looked at her banking app. The balance was $31.18. She had spent the rest on bread, fuel for the stove, and a single roll of duct tape. She thought, "I cannot fix a leaky roof. I am 66 years old with $31.18, and I cannot fix a leaky roof." The math of her life no longer added up. She was a library archivist with no archives. She was a wife with no husband. She was a mother with an empty locket. Her hands were so swollen she couldn't close them. Her lower back was a solid wall of fire. She stared at the dark ceiling and felt the cold of the floorboards seeping into her marrow. She thought, "This is where I die. Not today, but this is where it ends. This is what dying alone looks like. The world will find me in 6 months when the vines grow back over the door. Julian will tell everyone he did his best to help me. He will say I was always a bit unstable." She closed her eyes and waited for the dark to take her. A small, sharp sound woke her at dawn. It was a scratching against the floorboards. She opened her eyes and saw a small field mouse sitting on the edge of her electronics box. It was chewing on the corner of a cardboard folder. It didn't look at her with pity. It didn't care about her bank balance. It was just surviving. Eleanor sat up. Her spine clicked, a sharp, dry sound in the quiet room. She looked at the box of Leo's things. She looked at the mud on her boots. "I am not dying in a wet kitchen," she said. Her voice was a raspy whisper. "I am not dying because a man decided I wasn't worth the paper. My name was written on." She stood up. Her knees screamed, but she ignored them. She grabbed the plastic bucket and went back out into the rain. She kept walking. The kitchen smelled of damp cardboard and ozone as the sun began to bake the moisture out of the floorboards. Eleanor Vance, 66 years old, sat on a wooden crate. She pulled the electronics box toward her. The bottom of the box was a mush of grey pulp. It disintegrated in her hands. The ruggedized tablet slid out and hit the wood with a heavy thud. It was encased in thick, yellow rubber. It looked like a toy for a child, not a tool for a geologist. Eleanor picked it up. It was cold and heavy. She found the charging cable at the bottom of the box. The plastic coating was cracked, but the copper inside was still bright. She plugged it into the single working outlet above the counter. She waited. Her breath felt thin in her lungs. A small red light blinked on the edge of the frame. It was a tiny, rhythmic heartbeat. Eleanor sat on the floor next to the outlet. She didn't move. She didn't blink. The screen flickered. A logo appeared, then faded. Then the blue light of the home screen filled the dim kitchen. It was a photo of Leo. He was standing on a ridge, squinting into the sun. He looked exactly the way she remembered him. Eleanor touched the glass. Her finger left a smudge on his cheek. "Oh, Leo," she whispered. She found the gallery icon. Her hands were shaking so hard she missed the button twice. When it finally opened, she saw thousands of thumbnails. Most were of rock formations and soil samples. But then the images changed. The first one was a photo of a document. It was a bank statement from a private account in the Cayman Islands. Eleanor leaned closer. The name at the top was not Julian's. It was a holding company she had never heard of. She swiped to the next image. It was a scan of a deed. It was the deed to their main house, but the date was wrong. It was dated 6 months before the corporate restructuring, and her signature was at the bottom. Eleanor stared at the screen. She knew her own handwriting. She knew the way she looped the E in her name. But she had never seen this document. She had never signed away her rights to the house. She swiped again, and again. There were hundreds of scans. Leo hadn't just been taking photos of rocks. He had been using the office scanner at night. He had been building a digital archive of everything Julian thought he had shredded. She saw the emails. Julian had written to his lawyer about phasing out the marital assets. He had talked about Eleanor as if she were a piece of equipment that had reached the end of its depreciation schedule. Then she found the folder labeled, "For Mum." She tapped it. The screen went white for a second as the files loaded. It was a video. Leo was sitting in his college dorm room. He looked tired. He looked like he had been carrying a secret for a long time. "If you're seeing this," Leo said in the video, "it means Dad finally did it. He thinks he's the only one who knows where the bodies are buried. But I've been syncing everything to the cloud since senior year." Eleanor felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She reached up and touched the silver locket. It was still empty, but for the first time in months, it didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a shield. She looked at the metadata on the files. They were all time-stamped. They were all backed up to a server Julian couldn't touch. Every penny he had hidden and every document he had forged was sitting in the palm of her hand. She read the ledger scans 3 times. She checked the account numbers against the ones in the divorce papers. The discrepancy was millions of dollars. Julian hadn't just been cruel, he had been criminal. She spoke to the empty room. "He didn't delete you, Leo. He just moved you to a place he couldn't reach." She sat on the floor for a long time. The blue light of the tablet reflected in her eyes. The pain in her back was gone. The cold in her bones had turned into a steady, quiet heat. She took the silver locket off her neck. She opened the small, oval frame. She pressed the screen of the tablet against the locket. The light shone through the empty space. She knew exactly what to do. She started with the roof. Elias brought a stack of salvaged cedar shingles in the back of his rusted truck. He didn't ask for payment. Eleanor offered him the old copper piping she had pulled from the basement. It was a fair trade. She spent 14 days on a borrowed ladder. Her hammer hit the nails with a rhythmic ring that echoed through the valley. She replaced the rotted shingles one by one. Her thumb was bruised from missed strikes. The blisters on her palms turned into thick, yellow calluses. She didn't mind the pain anymore. Each new piece of wood felt solid under her hand. Every nail she drove held the structure firm against the sky. She moved to the stone walls next. She used a stiff wire brush and a bucket of white vinegar. The grey lichen fell away in dry flakes. Underneath, the limestone was the color of fresh cream. She found a bag of lime and sand in the back of the shed. She mixed it in a plastic tub. She used a small trowel to repoint the deep gaps in the chimney. The work was slow. Her shoulders burned every evening. She still slept on her mattress in the kitchen, but the floor remained dry. She had used a roll of flashing to seal the leaks above the stove. The kitchen felt different now. It was no longer a place of damp decay. It was a place of progress. She found 3 gallons of discarded white paint at the general store's swap shed. The lids were rusted shut. She used the crowbar to pry them open. She spent 4 days painting the window frames and the heavy front door. The white paint was thick and smelled of linseed oil. It took 2 coats to cover the weathered wood. The neighbors started to notice the change. A woman from the diner left a box of tomato seedlings on the porch one morning. A man from the hardware store dropped off a bag of mulch. They didn't stay to talk. They just left the gifts and drove away. In the valley, help was a quiet thing. Eleanor cleared the dead brush from the garden beds. She used a pitchfork to turn the heavy soil. She found a patch of heirloom peonies buried under a decade of weeds. They were already pushing through the dirt. Their red tips looked like small, sharp teeth. She cleared the space around them to give them room to breathe. She used the tablet every night. She sat at the oak table she had polished with beeswax. The blue light of the screen was the only lamp in the cottage. She organized the files Leo had left her. She made copies of every bank statement. She sent them to an encrypted drive she had created with a new password. She spent her afternoons at the creek. She carried flat stones back to the house in a canvas bag. She used them to level the porch and create a small walkway. Her leg muscles grew lean and hard. The physical pain of the first week had changed into a steady, manageable hum in her limbs. By the end of the second month, the cottage was transformed. The vines no longer choked the chimney. The porch no longer sagged into the mud. The windows were clear enough to see the ridgeline. The house sat on the hill like it had been there forever, watching the valley. The afternoon light came through the kitchen glass in long, golden bands. It hit the surface of the water in a glass jar on the counter. The water turned a bright, liquid yellow. The air inside smelled of cedar and the lavender she had hung to dry from the rafters. The house was no longer a liability. It was a fortress. Eleanor Vance, 66 years old, sat at the oak table with a cup of black coffee. The sun was not yet over the ridge, but the kitchen was filled with a soft, grey light. She held the silver locket in her palm, rubbing the smooth surface with her thumb. The metal was warm. It had taken on the heat of her skin. She looked at the tablet propped against a jar of dried lavender. The screen was dark, but she knew the ghosts were still inside, waiting for her command. She spoke to the empty chair across from her. "You were always better at math than I was, Leo," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was a steady, clear sound in the morning air. She didn't expect an answer. She just needed the words to exist in the room. She felt a strange, cool sensation in her chest, like a fever had finally broken. It was the first time in 38 years she wasn't wondering if she had forgotten anything. She went to the general store later that morning. She wasn't looking for supplies. She was looking for the bulletin board. She pinned a small, handwritten card to the cork. It said, "Archivist, Document Recovery and Preservation, no charge." She signed it with her full name. She didn't use the name Vance. She used her maiden name, Miller. It felt like putting on an old pair of boots that finally fit again. The first person to knock was a woman, named Sarah. She was younger than Eleanor, with hands that smelled of flour and yeast. She carried a shoebox, tied with a frayed blue ribbon. Inside were letters from the 1940s, sent from a ship in the Pacific. They had been stored in a damp basement and were starting to turn into a single, solid block of paper. Sarah didn't ask for charity. She asked if Eleanor had the tools to save them. Eleanor moved the box to the floor and cleared the table. She used a fine bristled brush and a palette knife she had found in the shed. She worked for 6 hours without looking at the clock. She didn't think about the legal papers. She didn't think about Julian's glass tower. She thought about the fibers of the paper and the ink that had survived a war. She felt a quiet strength in her fingers. She was reconstructing a history that someone else had lost. Sarah came back the next day with a basket of fresh eggs and a jar of honey. She sat on the porch and listened while Eleanor read one of the letters aloud. They didn't talk about the city or divorces. They talked about the way the light hit the ridge in the evening. This was the currency of the valley. It was a trade of skills and time, not a balance of power. Over the next month, the cottage became a hub. People brought their own versions of grey confetti. They brought torn deeds, faded photographs, and journals with water-damaged pages. Eleanor treated each one with the same meticulous care she had once given to Julian's ledgers. But the work belonged to her. She wasn't the engine under the hood. She was the person at the wheel. The inner transformation was not a sudden surge of joy. It was a slow, physical reclamation of her own space. She stopped checking her phone for notifications that would never come. She stopped looking in the mirror to see if she looked old enough to be discarded. She looked at her hands and saw the calluses from the roof and the stains from the ink. They were the hands of a woman who could build a house and save a memory. Elias stopped by on a Tuesday evening. He brought a stack of old maps from the post office basement. He sat at the kitchen table and watched her work. He didn't offer advice. He just watched the way she handled the paper. "You have the touch," Elias said. "Most people would just throw this away. They think if it's broken, it's gone." Eleanor looked at a map of the valley from 1890. She saw the creek and the stone bridge. She saw the spot where her cottage sat. "Nothing is ever really gone, Elias," she said. "Most people stop looking for pieces." She felt the peace then. It was a weightlessness in her limbs, a steady rhythm in her blood. She realized she no longer needed Julian to tell her who she was. She no longer needed a bank statement to prove value. She was Eleanor Miller, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She reached up and touched the silver locket. She hadn't put a new photo in it yet. She liked the way the space felt. It was an open door. It was a beginning. She stood up and walked to the porch. The sun was setting, turning the valley into a bowl of purple and gold. She took a deep breath. She didn't look back. She was still here. The black sedan appeared at the end of the gravel track at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday. It was a long, silent car that looked like a shard of obsidian against the green of the valley. It bounced once over the stone bridge and stopped 10 feet from Eleanor's new walkway. Julian Vance stepped out of the car. He was wearing a charcoal suit and a silk tie the color of a winter sky. He looked at the white-painted door and the clear glass windows of the cottage. He looked at the stone walls that Eleanor had scrubbed until they shone. He didn't look at the flowers. He looked at the roof. He squinted at the new cedar shingles as if he were looking for a flaw in a contract. Eleanor was standing on the porch. She was wearing her work trousers and the wool cardigan, with the frayed cuffs. Her silver hair was tied back in a practical knot. She held a garden trowel in her right hand. Her left hand rested on the silver locket. She didn't move. She didn't call out a greeting. She waited for the silence of the valley to settle around him. Julian didn't step onto the porch. He stayed on the gravel, mindful of his polished shoes. He checked his watch, the same gold piece Eleanor had chosen for him. He looked up and gave her a small, tight smile. "You've done a lot with the place, Eleanor," Julian said. His voice was smooth and practiced. "It's actually quite charming. I'm impressed." Eleanor watched him. She noticed the way his eyes kept darting toward the open kitchen window. "Why are you here, Julian?" Julian sighed. He put his hands in his pockets and looked toward the ridge. "I've been worried about you. The winter in this valley is brutal. I was talking to the legal team, and we felt we might have been a bit too hasty with the settlement." He took a step closer, but his eyes remained on the house. "We're just being realistic, Eleanor. At your age, maintaining a stone structure like this is a recipe for a medical emergency. I've found a very lovely assisted living community back in the city. It has a full-time staff and a library. We could sell this place and get you settled comfortably." Eleanor felt the weight of the tablet in the kitchen behind her. She thought about the Cayman accounts. She thought about the digital ghost of their son. "I'm not leaving the cottage, Julian," she said. Julian's smile didn't falter, but his voice sharpened. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. This property is a liability for someone on a fixed income. It's a clean break, remember? We're just being practical." He paused, then added the line he had clearly rehearsed. "Besides, there seems to be a minor issue with the corporate server. A few of Leo's old files are missing. I figured they might be in that box of junk I gave you. I'd like to take it back and have the IT guys look at it." Eleanor stepped down from the porch. She stood on the flat stones she had hauled from the creek. She was a head shorter than Julian, but she didn't feel small. She looked at the man she had spent 38 years serving. She saw the fear behind his polished exterior. "The files aren't missing, Julian," Eleanor said. "They're exactly where Leo put them. I've spent the last 3 weeks reading them. I know about the offshore accounts. I know about the 1988 deed to the cabin you said was lost. I know about the forged signature on the trust consolidation." Julian's face went very still. The mask of concern slipped for a fraction of a second. He looked at her as if she were a document he had failed to shred. "You should have been more financially responsible, Eleanor," he said. The caring tone was gone. His voice was cold and flat. "This is what happens when you spend your life as a spectator. You don't understand how the world actually works." "I was never a spectator," Eleanor said. "I was the person making sure you had a stage to stand on. I was the archivist of your life, Julian. I just finally decided to read the fine print." She walked to the kitchen window and reached inside. She picked up the yellow ruggedized tablet and held it up so he could see the blue light. "I've already sent the encrypted copies to a firm in the city," she said. "The one that handled the original incorporation. They seemed very interested in the metadata. They're calling it evidence." Julian took a step back toward his car. He looked at the tablet and then at the stone house. He realized he couldn't take it. He couldn't burn it. He couldn't manipulate a woman who no longer needed anything he had to offer. "What do you want?" Julian asked. He sounded tired now. He sounded like a man who had lost his place in the ledger. "I want you to drive back to the city," Eleanor said. "I want you to tell your lawyers that the settlement is being reopened, and then I want you to forget the road that leads to this valley." She turned her back on him. She walked back to the porch and sat in the wooden chair Elias had repaired for her. She picked up a book of local maps. Julian stood by his car for a long minute. The sun hit the glass of the sedan, creating a blinding glare. He opened the door and got inside. The engine started with a low, expensive purr. He backed the car down the track, the tires crunching on the gravel she had laid with her own hands. Eleanor didn't look up as the sound of the engine faded into the trees. She reached up and touched the silver locket. She felt the steady beat of her own heart beneath the metal. He was wrong about both. 1 year after the morning she arrived, the valley was a different color. The gray of the winter had been replaced by a green so bright it felt like a physical weight. Eleanor Vance, 67 years old, stood in the garden she had reclaimed from the thorns. The peonies were in full bloom, their heavy, wine-colored heads bowed toward the stone walkway she had built with her own hands. The cottage no longer looked like a house the vines had swallowed. The limestone walls were white and clean. The new cedar shingles on the roof had weathered to a soft, silver gray. A small wooden sign hung near the door. It said, "Miller Archives," in simple black letters. Eleanor went inside and sat at the oak table. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and the sweet, medicinal scent of bookbinding glue. A high-resolution scanner sat next to a magnifying lamp. A stack of town records from the 1860s waited for her attention. She wore a simple linen shirt. She was no longer a spectator in someone else's ambition. The legal proceedings in the city had concluded 3 months prior. The forensic accountants had found every dollar Julian had tried to bury. The clean break he had promised had turned into a total redistribution of the assets he had stolen. He had been forced to sell the glass tower. Eleanor had used her portion of the settlement to buy the land surrounding the cottage, ensuring the valley would remain as it was. Julian had sent a single, handwritten letter. It was full of the same caring language he had used for 38 years. He talked about misunderstandings and the stress of the business. Eleanor had read the first page and then placed it in the belly of the wood stove. She watched the ink curl and vanish into the flames. She reached up and touched the silver locket. She clicked the small clasp open. The oval frame was no longer empty. A tiny photograph of Leo sat inside. It was the image from the tablet, the one where he was squinting into the sun on the ridge. She had spent an afternoon trimming it with a pair of archival scissors until it fit perfectly. She snapped the locket shut. The sound was a sharp, final click in the quiet room. It was the sound of a story that had finally found its ending. Elias arrived a few minutes later. He was carrying a crate of glass plate negatives he had found in a barn 3 miles away. He set them on the counter and accepted a cup of coffee. They sat on the porch and watched the light move across the ridge. They didn't talk about the past. They talked about the weather and the price of timber. Eleanor looked at the yellow tablet sitting on the shelf. The battery was dead. The screen was dark. It didn't need to be powered on anymore. The truth it had carried was now part of the public record. She looked at the empty chair across the table and spoke into the silence. "We kept the records, Leo." She picked up her magnifying glass and went back to work. The sun dipped below the jagged edge of the ridge, casting long purple shadows across the stone porch. Eleanor Vance, 67 years old, wiped the dust from the heavy oak table. She placed the magnifying glass in its velvet-lined case. She turned off the archival lamp. The room smelled of old paper and the cool air of the evening. She walked to the window and looked at the valley. She reached for the silver locket. It was a solid weight against her skin. She didn't open it this time. She didn't need to see the photograph to know it was there. She knew the truth was safe because she had done the work to keep it. She felt a quiet sense of completion in her hands and her heart. A person's life is not made of the things a shredder can destroy. It is not found in the bank accounts or the deeds or the polished glass of a city office. A life is the record of what we choose to protect when everything else is taken away. It is the steady light of a son's memory and the strength to hold a hammer when your hands are shaking. Eleanor walked to the front door. She turned the heavy brass key in the lock. The mechanism moved with a smooth, oiled click. She stepped out onto the porch and looked at the stars appearing over the trees. She was a woman who had been erased and had written herself back into existence. She spoke to the wind. "The archive is closed for the night, Leo." If Eleanor's story moved you, if you've ever felt like your history was being rewritten by someone who didn't value your sacrifice, this journey is a reminder that you are the author of your own worth. Leave one word in the comments describing the moment Eleanor found the blue light in the dark kitchen. Because Eleanor's story proves something that is always true. The truth does not fear the fire, and justice does not have an expiration date. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their worth is not determined by the people who choose to leave, because together we prove that dreams don't age.